you can live the wrong life.
I used to defend you. They were absolutely right.
All your best acting is behind you. You're back to being a hack.
You gaslighted me. You're a fucking villain.
Jag har tagit alldeles för mycket hänsyn till dig i vårt samliv. Jag tror att hänsynen tog död på kärleken. Om jag hade givit mig själv lov att inte reagera med dåligt samvete så hade jag sett att allt det vi sa och gjorde mot varandra var fel.
Love is blind.
Now I got you.
Marriage is like having a stroke.
When I watch you eat, when I look at you lately, I just want to smash your face in.
Rachel, how are you?
Hi, I'm very alone anyway. I don't know how any of us are.
I'm so sorry that we can't have you here in Barcelona. It's such a pity.
I know. I've been reading about Barcelona reclaiming its identity, so maybe that's the price we all have to pay.
Yeah, totally. We're just gonna start talking in a few minutes because I'm gonna introduce you a little bit as I told you before. Benvinguts a tots, de fet, també moltíssimes gràcies per acompanyar-nos en aquest Primera Persona virtual. És una llàstima que hagi de ser virtual, però mentre esperem una edició que puguem fer física, com a mínim tenim això. Avui fem conversa amb la Rachel Cusk. Jo crec que serà una conversa molt apassionant, com tot el que ella escriu. M'imagino que la coneixeu, però per si de cas us explico algunes coses que potser no sabíeu. Ella va néixer al Canadà, se'n va anar a viure de seguida a Los Angeles i quan era petita encara ja se'n va anar a viure al Regne Unit. La revista Granta, el 2003, de fet, la va considerar una de les millors novel·listes joves britàniques, o sigui que d'alguna manera ja li va donar aquesta nacionalitat britànica. Per explicar una mica el que és la seva obra, faré una mica de trampa i utilitzaré una descripció que va fer una escriptora argentina fantàstica, la Mariana Enríquez, quan parlava de l'obra de la Rachel Cusk, i ella deia que tenia com 3 vides literàries. La primera és quan era una novel·lista elegant i molt irònica. Jo crec que aquí hi havia novel·les com Saving Agnes, La salvación de Agnes, que és la primera que va publicar amb Tassalaya, o Arlington Park, que li va publicar Lumen. La segona part seria una sèrie més autobiogràfica, que és quan la Mariana Enríquez diu que es va convertir en famosa i polèmica, d'això en parlarem amb ella segur, i aquí podríem parlar d'aquestes obres més autobiogràfiques com Life's Work, que parlava sobre la seva maternitat, que aquí no s'ha traduït, The Last Supper, un llibre que no es troba, el van haver de destruir, també us explicarem per què, i Aftermath on Marriage and Separation, que és un llibre que ara tot just es publica aquí gràcies a Libros del Asteroide i que es titula Despojos. I la tercera part de la vida literària de la Rachel Cusk seria quan ella es converteix en una narradora d'autoficció i d'alguna manera aquí és quan situem la seva trilogia, que també està traduïda per Libros del Asteroide, que és A Contraluz, Tránsito i Prestigio, i on hi trobem una protagonista que costa molt poc reconèixer, i la Rachel, perquè també és escriptora, també s'ha separat i d'alguna manera s'està intentant recomposar del que ha estat aquest trencament familiar. I ara sí, okay, I think everyone knows, if they didn't, a little bit more about you. So I finished my introduction with the trilogy, but I would like to start talking about a life's work, because then when you wrote it, you had already written some novels, and I would like to know what made you change, what made you write that memoir?
Well, I think the shock of motherhood for everybody, for any woman, is a shock of truth in your life. And I think women realize all sorts of truths about their lives in that moment, and the things that are possible and the things that are impossible. And I suppose to a degree, the things that have been artificial or unnecessary or a luxury even. The reality of motherhood is very stripping of one's persona and one's understanding of life. So I think to bring all of that, because obviously in my life as a writer, there wasn't very much separation between living and working. So it absolutely, that message, that experience penetrated to the core of everything that I thought and felt and believed. And I think I realized that in the novel form, as I understood it and as I practiced it, there was no possibility of describing the things that I was feeling and that were happening to me and that I perceived, you know, the new light in which it made me perceive the world could not be described accurately in a novel. To describe them in a novel would be to completely turn inside out the basis on which those things are being felt. You know, when you have a baby, you can't even read a novel because you can't go that far away from this new reality. So the idea that you would write one and put it all in there seemed, and that in the end came to seem like something that was actually wrong with femininity in the novel writing process, and the difficulty really of truly inhabiting and rendering ordinary female experience in literary form. So that was a sort of, I had to kind of break off and I didn't really know what it meant or what it would lead to. I didn't think anyone would read it. I thought it was a low subject. I thought it was beneath, you know, the contempt of, you know, literary intellectuals. I didn't really know. I just knew that if I was going to say something, it had to be like that.
Yeah, you knew that fiction would be useless for that.
Yeah.
And I suppose then that the truth became something really important, or honesty. Not that honesty can't exist when we talk about fiction, but in a different way.
Yeah, in a different way. Well, the role of myself and of my own life became much, much clearer to me. That if I was going to live truthfully and not live as a writer, which lots of writers do, and that's maybe a nicer way to live and an easier life, I don't know, but I wasn't going to do that, because it seemed to me that the one thing that I had in front of me as a way of experiencing reality was this female, very ordinary female destiny, a biological destiny, something I shared with, you know, pretty much every other woman, and I wasn't going to make myself special or try and hide it or so that did seem to me to give me a goal, I guess, or a feeling that I had something to say that hadn't been said before.
Mm-hmm. But I think that many women didn't seem to understand what you were telling them. Lots of them were moms themselves also.
They were the worst.
Yeah, I think so. Could you explain us that? Because I was really surprised by the reaction. Critics were really fierce, and people even accused you of hating children, I think, which I find something really, really hard to be.
Well, I think a lot of women, when they have a baby, are shocked by what they discover about other women and about womanhood. That I think there's a real feeling that you've, I suppose, been trapped in what sometimes feels like the world of the past, or of stuff, you know, that all of your freedom and your free choices and your individuality are completely erased in this new world of looking after a child, and you're told what to do and you're told how to behave and you're disapproved of if you don't do that and behave like that. So there's great conformity that arrives in that moment, and for certain people that is a very difficult, isolating, shocking experience. And I think I was one of those people. So I think there are some people who would completely recognize what happened to me through the book as what happens generally to certain women in motherhood. That there's a sort of group mentality, and anyone who says anything different or complains or is ejected. And I think it follows that the women who do the ejecting, who are defending the myth and saying it's all wonderful and fantastic and aren't we lucky, and you know, they're doing that for a reason. They're and I mean, I think it's something that I talk about elsewhere in my work. It's the operation of ambivalence. It's how, you know, it's how people behave, you know, how people disown dangerous feelings by attaching them to somebody else and blaming them. So, you know, it wasn't difficult to understand why that happened. And I think also, you know, the subject is very much in the general realm, and it's not a literary subject, and yet I am a literary person. It's not an intellectual subject, but I'm an intellectual person. So, you know, these same women who, for them, it was maybe a badge of honor to have lost their independent sort of way of thinking, and their, you know, it sort of showed that they were sort of working too hard as mothers, you know, to actually sort of think about it or analyze it. So I think it's no surprise that happened to the book, but it was shocking, the sort of violence and rudeness of it. Yeah.
And wasn't it painful? Because I mean, this was such a personal exposure and honesty, and people in some way, I mean, when they don't like a novel, they're talking about a novel, but they're not talking about you. In that particular case, when you start doing a memoir, people feel like they have the right to attack you personally.
Yeah. And again, I think that was it was a brutal and painful experience, but it made me realize that I was right, and that I was doing something, however painful, that it wasn't pointless. It wasn't meaningless. I touched a nerve, and I guess that carried on in other things I wrote, being something that you know, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to make people angry or upset them, but the things that I was seeking to define, seeking to see the truth of, were things that it seems other people are very desperate not to know the truth of and not to hear about. So that really set up a pattern, I guess, for, you know, the next few years of in which I felt pretty battered and pretty politicized, and not always very supported, because, you know, literary culture in the UK is very misogynistic, old-fashioned, conventional. I didn't have a lot of supporters sort of in my own culture, and also I was looking after small children, so, you know, I was still having to live that life.
But do you think that would have been different today?
It's impossible to know.
Sorry.
I'm sure there are other ways in which women are willfully scapegoated and misunderstood. You know, I know there are. Whether there's more permission to say what you feel about having children, or, you know, there probably is. Yeah, and maybe my book was part of why there is. So yeah, it probably is a different world now, but I would have to hear from women themselves that they were finding motherhood substantively easier in some way, for, you know, for that change to really be worth anything.
There is another memoir that you wrote, I think 8 years later, which is The Last Supper, but this is a novel that we can't find. It had to be destroyed because I think someone who appeared in the book threatened you with a lawsuit.
It's still in print, but I had to take out a lot of passages.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But no, it's still. I don't think it's translated into Spanish.
No, it's not in Spanish. Definitely.
Yeah, but it's still in print in English.
Okay. And what happened, because when you write a memoir, of course you talk about you, but you also talk about other people. And I suppose that in that case, other people didn't agree with what you had written.
Yeah, I think it was a little more shameless and cynical than that on their part. They realized that if they made because they were recognizable in the book, sort of, just about, only by someone who would know them, that there was essentially a very simple legal process whereby they could get a few £1,000s without anyone being able to do very much about it. So that was what happened. And unless I was prepared to go to court and fight it, there was nothing I could do about it. So, but yeah, it was unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm sorry for you. I didn't know it worked like that. But when you write about other people in your memoirs, how do you think about them? Because, for example, at the end of Aftermath, when your children read the book, they won't be ashamed by what you wrote.
Well, to me, it's pretty clear that writing works more or less like the law, and anything that happens, you can't go to prison for thinking something. You only go to prison for doing something or saying something. And where do we get our knowledge of one another from? We get it from being shown things that we choose to show each other. If I say something, I can't say, "Oh, promise you won't say that to somebody else." I've said it, and I have to take responsibility for it. I've put it in the public domain. And so I think the morality of memoir works very much like that. And there are lots and lots of areas of life that I wouldn't particularly go into, especially like my brothers and sisters, for example, because they didn't choose. None of us chose to be related in that way. And while we were growing up, we couldn't choose what we showed each other. So I have thought about it very carefully, and I think that the sort of difficult area is in terms of one's own children, and especially trying to write the kinds of things that I'm writing, of and I've been accused a lot of sort of violating their privacy, or but I don't think I have done that, because the sort of space where children are in my memoirs is generally, I guess I use my sort of ability to write fiction and to understand how character and form function in fiction, very much in that area. So I create a sort of children's space that doesn't actually have much to do with my actual children. And I think now that they're older, they're entitled to say, "We don't want you writing about us anymore." So they haven't said that. They would flick through and like, "Is there any? Am I in it?" So I don't think they mind too much.
There's always a danger, I think, when you write a memoir, because then readers, they think they know you. And I have the impression that sometimes us, the readers, we think that we have the right to know things, or lots of things that sometimes a writer doesn't tell us. And for example, on that book, Aftermath, I wrote a critic where the critic said, "Yeah, but we don't know why she separated her husband." And I thought, Yeah, but that doesn't matter. I mean,
No, I know. I mean, but it's amazing how much I get that completely contradictory, because they're saying, oh, it's so terrible to make these things public, and she hasn't told us enough. She hasn't given us the gory details. So, you know, it's there. It is. There's the contradiction.
But do you recognize that that thing that sometimes the readers, we think we know the writer?
No, because I've known enough writers.
Okay.
To see that, and in fact I am one, so I know how my work has a life of its own. It has an identity of its own, and I do the work, but I'm not it, and it isn't me. That's not to disown it. It's to say that there is a mystery somewhere in this. When it's done properly, there's a mystery there. And I mean, what's strange is that the trilogy of novels that I wrote, Outline, and you know, which is fiction, more than any of my books, that one has generated an assumption. Whenever critics or interviewers or readers talk to me about it, they always say, oh, and you know the bit when you do that in the so that and that's really what I wanted in those books. I really wanted them to look like that. So I sort of don't mind. You know, I didn't want the reader to feel that these books were being sort of made up by someone, that there was any sort of pretending going on. So I sort of count that as a success. But yeah, it's funny that it happens far more with the novels than with the memoirs.
Mm. I would like to talk about the novels too, but I wanted to ask you something about Aftermath, because when you start the book, you started saying, recently my husband and I separated. And I would like to know, I thought, doesn't she need the distance to write about something that just happened?
I have thought about that, and I did wonder it at the time. And in fact, one or two people said that to me. They said, oh, your feelings about it changed so much. But it was a bit like motherhood. I only remembered what it had been like to have a baby when I had another baby. And I thought, oh my God, I've forgotten this, and I must write it down. It's so that is what you forget. And in fact, the same is true of that experience of separation. That, I mean, thank God I don't think about it anymore. I'm glad I'm not still, you know, writing about that. But I think there was something about writing it in the pain of the moment that conserved something of its rawness, and that, I mean, it just seems that that's how I work. And as I say, it's not something I would particularly have wanted to sit and think about in a calm and considered way. And yeah, when I missed some things.
Yeah.
Well, maybe. maybe I would have written it differently. I don't know.
Is it? Do you write differently when it's a novel or when it's a memoir?
No, not really. They both sort of take the same. It's the same tools, the same work, the same process. The same business of seeing a form. You know, the decision to write a memoir is literally, it's like a suit of clothes. It's just thinking this is the right form for this material, and that's usually things that are deeply sort of individual female experiences. That there's no general truth about them. They're not shared. They're experiences in which your aloneness is paramount. So that seems, and until I got the trilogy and sort of found this way of allowing people to speak as individuals and own their own stories. I just couldn't imagine kind of delivering that material to some narrator in a novel and for it to survive. So yeah, the process is similar. I mean, the difference is that there's more comedy, I guess, available in, although A Life's Work is a pretty funny book, but there's more comedy, you know, you can write a funny novel. It's harder to write, for me anyway, to write a funny memoir.
Mm-hmm. You just said, I think, that this is like a feminine experience, and in Aftermath, it's funny also because you talk about being a feminist or not being a feminist, because your husband, he accuses you of not being one of them, and then you start thinking about that and you say, okay, maybe I'm not a feminist.
Well, because he thinks he's the feminist, and then I realized that in this kind of marriage, you're not even a woman. So how can you be a feminist? I guess that was my little very dark joke in Aftermath.
Yeah, but I suppose,
of course, I am a feminist. So
yeah, I know. But I thought that it was great how you told us with this honesty how you felt, really, and you're not afraid of saying things that maybe because we know that you are a feminist, we can be surprised by you saying some things. I mean, truth can make you vulnerable also.
Yeah, well, I've never managed to learn that lesson somehow.
Oh. When you say that, does that mean that it's difficult for you to read about what people say about your books after you've published?
I never do read it. I haven't for years. No.
Okay.
Which is a shame, apparently, because some people say nice things about it. So, but it's just, I had to give it all.
After writing Aftermath, I think you experienced a period during which you didn't know exactly how to write, like as if there was I don't know if I can say it like that, but like a creative death for you.
Yeah, that was the end of reading reviews. But it was also, you know, I think that everything I've done has had is a reflection or an echo or some kind of imaging of a phase or aspect of living, and you know, I think that blankness, that nihilism after the breakdown of certain structures of living, I think that's something that absolutely belongs to life. And, you know, it is a thing that people feel, and I felt it too. There was nothing to say, you know, for a little while, and when there was something to say, it was so formless and sort of new and strange and without precedent that I thought, well, how can this be said? How can this be said? And you know, the reason I had to think that was I guess because, you know, these are radically new ways of living. You know, there is no particular history of a woman sort of coming out of sort of long established structures of femininity, marriage, motherhood, home, able to support herself, able to carry on living in the world, not scorned and reviled by society for, you know, being like, you know, I mean, essentially it's not against the law, and yet what is it? You know, how are you meant to be? And yeah, these are new things to describe. So, and I think there were a lot of politics of that I sort of began talking about in Aftermath, about men and women and how they live together, that it took me a long time to really think about how I could investigate those without anger and without subjectivity, how I could basically detach these things from my own story, because they needed to be, because it was no longer about the individual person in these in these structures, it was about complete lack of structure, lack of identity, being lost basically, and so it took me a long time to think about how to do that, how to make it impersonal.
Mm-hmm. But even if it becomes impersonal, you start from your own life. I mean, the questions you ask yourself when you are gonna write are questions that come from the way you live your life.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I guess that's what being an artist is, and it isn't going and looking things up on the internet or doing research or pretending that you were alive in 1843, or to me it's a very different kind of calling to that, and I can't think of a artist or writer whose work I value that isn't completely reflective of where and how they lived. Proust writes about France. Yeah, I think it's a very strange modern. I guess it's our obsession with narrative and with this idea of imagination as essentially uncoupling everything from reality. That there's there's this strange idea that it's rather shameful, not to completely make up absolutely everything in your book. I would never dream of making something up. So yeah.
You said that you didn't know how to do that, and I think that form was really, really important for you, even more than content.
Yeah, well, especially in the world as it is now, where we suffer from an overabundance of ugliness and of unnecessary objects and meaningless objects and too much stuff. And for me, finding a form is it really means finding something that is entitled to exist, that has its own existence, because it's closely connected to life. And that's why I stay close to my own life, because I need to, my knowledge of that has to come from my own instincts and my own experience. Yeah, I don't want to create some great big monstrosity of sort of unnecessary verbiage.
I think that maybe that is related to something that I wrote. You said in an interview about characters doesn't existing anymore, or in the fact that they are useless now, characters or landscapes, if I understood well.
Yeah, characters don't. I mean, if a novel is using character in a traditional way, then that's talking about people in novels. It's not talking of, I don't think people function that way anymore, because character requires a degree of staticness. It requires repetition and staying in one place and being observed repeating behavior. So, and when does that ever happen? Not very often. So no, I don't think that character can be used as a device in a book in quite the same way. But that's okay. There's more interesting things to do than make people up and get them to say things. So.
But and in fact, when people ask me what is outline about, it's hard for me to explain, in the sense that I feel that like it's not much about a plot, but it's like people talking and expressing how they feel or what they lived, and the way they do it also, because Faye, the writer, she's more a listener than a protagonist, I would say.
Well, it's it's a sort of deconstructed novel, in the usual the usual sort of parts that conceal the workings aren't there. So So no, there's no plot, but there's a lot of plots in how people see their own lives. There's the plot of life, you know, times 100. So it does make it it does make it difficult to describe, but
it's fine. I mean, no,
I hope that's okay. Maybe that will
no worries. Yeah. And I think you give also the readers a lot of freedom to, I don't know how to express that, but to judge, or maybe, I don't like that word, judge, but it would be that, what the persons that she meets tell, because she is not judgmental at all. As I said, she's more like a listener, and they go there and they tell things, and yes, sometimes she notices something about the way they tell their stories. And of course, there's this thing also, we all want to look nice when we tell a story about us, and that happens also sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, I did worry that, I mean, I think that Reading Outline and the other two books is not a passive experience. It requires the reader to be active. You're not being told, oh, and then this happened, and then this happened. You know, what happens is not in the hands of the book, and that becomes apparent at a certain point, I guess, when you're reading it and you think, oh, there's this liftoff into suspended disbelief is not going to happen. And I guess I worried that would make it very, very difficult for people to read it. So I've been extremely surprised that people have been able to read it and enjoy it, and have found it really what I most wanted, which was unstressful. I think there's so much stress in narrative, and I have come to hate it so much. I've come to hate the force that makes you turn the pages as though there's some goal, this ending, and we all know that, you know, that is the worst possible way to live, to completely forget that you are mortal and that time's passing because you're so believing something that's going to happen next. So I really, really, really wanted to just put a big spanner in that wheel, and I found it a very relieving and experience, not feeling that dread of suspense as a writer, and I hope that's true for readers as well.
I think I'll do that from now on. When someone asks me what the books are about, I will say that they remind us that we are mortal.
I'm not sure that's going to be a bestseller, but
maybe you'd be surprised. I'm sorry because we're running out of time, but I would like to ask you something about how you began writing, because I think, you published your first novel when you were 26. Had you always wanted to be a writer?
I didn't know that you could be a writer, so I didn't know that was a job. I thought they were all dead. I mean, I've always used paper and pen from earliest life to create a reflection of myself and a defended space of myself against other versions of life, and you know, I guess something in my particular family circumstances made that very important and made me do that, but it was what I always did, and as I say, I didn't think that was that private thing could ever be a public thing, but I was very driven to do it right from the start, and I always have been. I've stayed very driven to do it, so yeah, I've been writing for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And I think
3 or something.
3?
Something like that, yeah.
Wow.
Because I learned that right, I think.
And do you keep that first writings?
No, I don't know where that part of my archive is. So yeah, lost in the mists of time.
Can I finally ask you? I know that you just published Coventry essays in 2019. Can I ask you, are you writing something at the moment?
I am about 2 weeks away from finishing a novel, in fact.
Wow.
Really surprised me. It's like a late baby. It really surprised me. So this strange situation of lockdown had an absolutely immediate effect on me. It was like someone turned off the noise and suddenly I could hear myself think. So I mean, I'd had this novel brewing away and I was sort of thinking, what's the point? Am I ever going to do this? What will ever make me do it? Because there's part of me that feels very sick of that whole idea of being published, of, you know, anyway, yeah, for whatever reason, I suddenly, it was like a switch being flicked and I sat down and wrote it and I'm nearly done. So that's very strange.
Yeah, great. Well, congratulations.
You're the first to hear it. So.
Great. Thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you so much for being with us on Skype or Zoom, or I don't remember.
I hope I can come in person very soon.
Yeah, please. We'll be waiting for you.
Yeah.
It will be great to see you, and it will be great to read that new book that you've almost finished.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. See you soon, I hope.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.